Good morning, and a freilichen Zeis Chanukah, last day of Chanukah. We're in Ayin Beis, volume 3, page 1271. But we went back to page 1211 and 1212 to understand the context and the whole flow. So I'm going to continue now the review that I began yesterday. Back on page 1212. I'm going to move over to page 1213 and hopefully now sum up everything we learned there, then review what transpired after that and how it brought us back to what we're discussing now, so the full circle of the subject matter. So what did we review yesterday? A few of the key elements of Gan Eden and the schar, the reward that we receive for our work. It's clear here that reward is not like candies or toys or incidental, arbitrary payment for whatever we do, but it's actually the energy that we generate through our mitzvahs. Like he says, schar mitzvah, the mitzvah itself generates energy. And the question is, what energy does it generate? Where is it located? And what is the difference between the different levels? There's also the question is, what is the relationship between physical mitzvahs, doing them in action, which is paramount, and the spiritual energy that it generates? So briefly, if you weren't to use the words Gan Eden or Elim Haba, Gan Eden essentially is the storehouse, if you wish, of the energy that's generated through our avodah. So there's Gan Eden on its own, and there's Gan Eden that is increased like a garden that is fruit and its produce is increased through working that garden, which is our avodah. By Adam Harishon and Avram Avinu is all spiritual, or primarily spiritual, I should say, primarily. So that makes sense. After Matan Torah began a new avodah, which is primarily the physical, that the main thing is doing things in a gashmistic way. And yet we still say that our Maisa mitzvahs generate energy in Gan Eden. So what does that mean? So he explained that there's two parts to a mitzvah. There's the action of the mitzvah, and there's the kavanah, the intention. So the intention is what generates the energy in Gan Eden. But the intention, the kavanah, without the Maisa mitzvah is like nothing. It's like you did nothing. So you need the action, but you need the intention to create a spiritual energy that results from that intention. Now, he did say that the Maisa mitzvah creates the energy in Gan Eden Atachten, and the kavanah mitzvah is in Gan Eden Elim. But he made it very clear on page 1212, when he breaks it down, he says, that this also means kavanah. So that's two different kavanas. The general kavanah, kabol sel malchus shamayim, that you do a mitzvah, that's not just the action, but you're also doing it as part of accepting the yoke of heaven. He says that is what generates Teisvus in Gan Eden Atach. And the kavanah apiyasod, apnimi, the delving into the details, the inner secrets or the inner dimensions, and the specific avodah of all mitzvah, like binding the mind and the heart, or binding the heart and the mind in tefillin, that generates an energy in Gan Eden Elyon. So bottom line is that the action of the mitzvah, which he asked the question, how can action generate spirit? What's the connection between action and spirituality? First of all, initially action is a lower level. Then he says action is actually a higher level, because that's the kavanah mitis, and it's far higher than the spiritual. So the answer is the spiritual is the part of the kavanah, that the intention that the person has. They're not just doing it mechanically, they're doing it with intention. And the two intentions that we just described. Okay. But without intention at all, it does not mamshech in Gan Eden. However, Elim Haba, it does, because Elim Haba is in the future, Tchias HaMesim, Neshamas Begufim, so even Peish Yisrael, who are filled with mitzvahs, but they don't have the kavanah, they too, Kol Yisrael, Yesh Lam Chelik Le'Elim Haba. because Elam Haba is a very different type of experience. Gan Eden, as we learned earlier, is Mamala Kalam. That is filling up existence with a divine energy that we can relate to, that is commensurate to existence. That is a level that is specifically to the level of each person, is a different level of divine revelation. So there's a difference between Gashmis and Ruchnis. And in Ruchnis itself, even though he doesn't spell it out, the fact of the matter is Mamala Kalam, and that's the whole point of Mamala Kalam. It's divine energy that's tailored and customized to each individual creature according to its needs. So that is Gan Eden. Even the abundant and the increased energy through Avodah, he said clearly, is still, he said in the page 1211, is still Yeshlemer, he said, is still of the same paradigm of Gan Eden. It's still that garden. However, the garden now is producing a lot more because you're working the garden. That's Mamala Kalam. Olam Haba is Sevav Kalam. Sevav Kalam is an equalizer. And he made two distinctions. Gan Eden, Mamala Kalam, and number one is there's the difference between levels, between Gashmis and Ruchnis. And that's why if you do a mitzvah b'Gashmis, but you don't have a Ruchnis kavana, a spiritual intention, you don't get the schar in Gan Eden. And whereas in Elam Haba, it's not, that distinction does not exist. Everything is equalized. And the second point was that Mamal Klam, it's a Ur b'Keli. You need a Keli to an Ur. And if you don't have the Keli, you don't have the Ur. So therefore, since it's a Keli to Ur, he says, that's a Ma'aisha Shel Mitzvah. And the Ma'aisha itself is not a Keli. Because physical act is not a container to Ruchnistic energy. A physical act is connected to the Etzem, as he said. But that's not a form of a Keli to an Ur. So that's the second distinction. The Gan Eden is a Keli to an Ur, and therefore you need to have that Keli. If you don't have the Kavan, you don't have the Keli. And Elam Haba is not a Keli to an Ur, as he said. It's Ma'isa Mitzvah Ein Be'erech L'chinas Keli L'Ratzon Elyon. It's only Etzem HaRatzon, Sevav Ma'isa Asma. So that's the distinction. Then the final thing that we reviewed was the bottom of page 1212. The question now, the Razal say that there's no schar in this world. Schar mitzvah b'haya al maleka. It's only in Elam Haba, the future. So the Rebbe Rashab asked a series of questions on this. Isn't it fact we just said that mitzvahs increase energy in Gan Eden, and Gan Eden is before Elam Haba? So how do you say that the schar doesn't exist until the future of Elam Haba? That's the first question. And then the second one, what is the difference between Gan Eden and Elam Haba? They both are a reward for our work. What's the distinction? So he already said briefly what it is, Mamala Sevav, but still he wants to understand. The fact that Elam Haba's neshamas begufim, what does that exactly achieve? Seemingly there's an advantage of a neshamas without gufim, a soul without a body. That's the next question. And the mere fact that we say there's no schar in this world, besides Gan Eden, how do you reconcile that with all the verses in the Torah that say when you'll do mitzvahs, you'll get reward? Like, honor your parents in order to live long on this world. And also, finally the Razal say that these are the five things that a person benefits and eats the fruit in this world, and the Keren Kayemes and the principle remains in Elam Haba. So he asked the question, what are these five different than all the others? And how do you just reconcile that? You just said there's no schar for no mitzvahs. On the other hand, the Psukim speak about all mitzvahs having schar. So bottom line, this all needs clarification. What reward? What's the level of the reward? What's the difference between Gan Eden and Elam Haba? And that's where he leaves it at the bottom of page 1212. Now, on page 1213, which I'm going to review now, continuing the review, so then we'll set the stage for everything that comes afterwards. So the Rebbe Rashab says on top of 1213, to understand this, we need to further evaluate and understand and dissect what exactly is this Gilui of Gan Eden. So we know it's Mamala Kalaman, we know it's a divine energy that needs a b'Keli. We know that you need to earn it through Kavana. But what exactly is this Gilui of Gan Eden? So this is going to begin the process that will ultimately turn into understanding in general all the levels of growth that we go through. Remember, the fact that we grow from child to adult, and also in our Avodas Hashem growth, is a very much of a mamala kalalman experience, because it means there's growth level by level by level. That's Seder Shtalshus. When you're talking about the levels that he's talking etzem, that's only higher levels that you reach once you go through these stages, as we're going to learn later. So even though, yes, a child does a simple mitzvah, it touches God, the etzem, but it's not integrated. It's not internalized. That's not the kavanah. That's the beginning. That is the foundation of it all. But you need to work on and need to learn Torah and daven and do mitzvahs. Become an adult that is fully consumed and occupied. Not just you do a mitzvah in the morning or whenever it is and you connect, that it should permeate you, that you should become a godly person. To become a godly person, it's not enough just to have the etzem. It's like saying you have the etzem and neshama. The essence of your soul is intact. Yes, that's intact no matter what you do. But that's not the kavanah to know that that's intact. The point is to bring the etzem begilui, that your arms and your legs and your eyes and your ears and your mind and your heart and all of you is consumed with v'haftas Hashem lekecha b'chol avavcha b'chol nafshecha b'chol maidecha. All of you, as we're going to learn later, that these are the levels that as we grow. So the point that is, so Gan Eden is very clearly connected to that dimension. And there, that's Giluyim. That's not just Etzem. However, Giluyim without Etzem, like he said, is like having Kavanah without a mitzvah. That's not enough. So you need the mitzvah and the Kavanah. So now, I'm just putting it in context of what we've learned, so it'll make things easier to understand. So now he goes and says, okay, so what is this Gilui in Gan Eden? Now we've learned this already, but as we saw yesterday, when you go back after everything we've learned, it comes alive and makes much more, the contextualization of it gives much more clarity. So I'm going to go over again, I'm not going to read everything, I'll just read main points, because we don't have to go, and you can always review it yourself. So he says, Gan Eden is the Gilui of Er Hatzilus. And when we say Vayita Havai Elokim Gan Be'eden, like we learned already, that when God planted in a garden in Eden, it says Shem Maleh Havai Elokim. He already said this on page 1211, where he said that the world is only Elokim, and Gan Eden is Havai Elokim. Now he's adding that this is the level of Atzilus. The Isavas Elim is from Shem Elokim. I'm reading from I'm looking at the top of 1213. So you can follow along. As I said, I'm just going to highlight. Because Havai itself, you can't create a world. You need to have a tzimtzum, a concealment. You need, because Atzilus itself is completely divine. It's a structure. It's a divine structure. It has Chochma, Binah, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Oires, Bekelim. Remember that. It's a structure, but it's a divine structure. So to create existence as we know that has its own identity, a yesh, that has its own independent identity, not like Atzilus, you need Elokim. So Elokim creates the concealment that allows Er Atzilus to go through this so-called, through this concealment, and that is what creates the creation. Okay. In the parentheses, he adds, just qualifies that these concealments are only compared from the perspective of the creation. But from the perspective of but it's still a concealment that creates a yesh, and he refers to the gvuras and tzimtzumim of Malchus that were discussed a lot earlier in volume 2. Gan Eden, on the other hand, is also part of existence, but it's a higher state of consciousness. So think of Gan Eden as a higher state of spiritual consciousness. Why? There we say Havai Elokim. You don't just say Bereshis bar Elokim, Vayemer Elokim yihi oyer, Vayemer Elokim yihi rakia, but you say Vayita Havai Elokim Gan Be'eden. So in other words, in Gan Eden, you don't only have Elokim, you also have Havaya, and that he calls That means in Gan Eden radiates also the Shem Havaya of Atzilus. Okay, but he's going to now explain what that means. Based on this, it would sound like Gan Eden is Atzilus. But it's Gilu Er Atzilus. It means in the worlds of Biyah, of Bria, Yitzir and Asiya, so there's two levels. There's the level of the regular worlds, and there's Gan Eden in Bria, Yitzir and Asiya. And that's what he says now. That what? In Gan Eden radiates Er Havaya Atzilus. And now he spells it out exactly where is the location, so to speak, spiritual location of this Gan Eden. So he says, Hine Gan Eden be'etzem hu be'Bria. Gan Eden fundamentally is in the world of Bria. Hainu Gan Eden ha'elyon. That's the higher Gan Eden. For Gan Eden ha'tachten ba'Asiya. And the lower Gan Eden is in Asiya. Sometimes it does say Yetzirah, but now he's teaching it as Asiya. Okay, so what is the pshat? That Gan Eden, think of it this way. God created, first I'll talk physically. He created a planet, the planet Earth, with all the continents and all the whole entire Earth. In it, he planted a garden in a special place, and that garden has more Gili Alakus, Havaya Lakim, that draws from Atzilus, the Havaya of Atzilus. So the same thing on the worlds above. Biyah, Bria, Tzir, Asiya is a certain structure of creation, 3 stages. In it, there's a Gan Eden that's a special state that's not Atzilus, but in it radiates Atzilus. But now comes the big question, the question that he's been asking literally from the middle of, from almost the beginning, well, a third into volume 2, or halfway into volume 2, how can Atzilus radiate in Bria? The whole point that Bria, we just said, needs a tzimtzum. So he asks, so if you said there was no Gan Eden, here's Atzilus, and here's Biyah through a tzimtzum, fine. But you're telling me that there's in Biyah, there's a special state that has Atzilus in it. So then, how is that possible? The whole point is that it should be a creation, not Atzilus. So how does Atzilus radiate into Gan Eden? That's the question, which we already learned the answer to. But we're going back to the original question. How do you do it? The Masha'er Atzilus Ein Sof Lispashtuse. If you remember, we learned about the difference between Ein Sof and the difference in Eris and Kelim, that Ein Sof and Ein Sof and Atzmus Ein Sof. So we learned there that Atzilus is Ein Sof Lispashtuse. It is infinite, not in all directions. Chochma is infinite, Binah is infinite. It extends infinite. So we know that is Hurak B'Madregas Atzilus. That's what makes Atzilus unique. It's only in the level of Atzilus. But that's self-contained in the world of Atzilus. It's like saying the Beis HaMikdash is the holiest part of the earth, right? The Beis HaMikdash and the Har HaBayis. It's holier than any other part of the world. But that holiness is only within the temple. It doesn't extend outward. So even though Israel, the land of Israel, is a holy land, but its holiness is not the holiness of the temple. Just like in the Beis HaMikdash, the holiness of the Holy of Holies is greater than the holiness of the Holy, of Kodesh, and so on. Eser Kadesh's Hain, the Mishnah says. There are 10 levels of Kedusha, but each one is contained in its world. So then, since Atzilus is Atzilus, so how do you say that Gan Eden has a Gilui of Atzilus in Bria? And definitely, how can it go into Asiya? Gan Eden Atach. And this is where he adds, for Atzilus goes into Biyah, it goes through partitions that causes the to no longer be the same original It's like a that's a product of the so to speak. It's like a second bounce. It's like a reflection of the reflection. Through the parsa shebein Atzilus lebiyah, through the partition that separates them. And how can there be Atzilus in Biyah? The second part of the question is, how is it possible that the neshamas of Biyah should receive this Atzilus? To benefit and enjoy the reflection of the Shekhinah of Atzilus and not be annihilated, not be obliterated. Now, this question has been answered. We'll get back to the answer when we review the continuation. So right here, the Rebbe Rashab has now addressed the level of Gan Eden and asked the question about how does Gan Eden bridge Atzilus and Bri and Biyah. Now he begins, and here I'm going to skip, but I'll just shortly, it's just to give the flow. He says, Yesh lahagdim, and he goes into a whole discussion on Ani Rishon v'Ani Achrin, the difference between Chochma and Keser, Rishon and Reishis. Now, when you read it initially, it seems like, where is this coming from? Why do we even have this whole introduction? But this will go now for several pages. It's going to go all the way to page 1218. So now the next 5 pages are dedicated to understanding Keser and Chochma, and then in Malchus itself, the different levels of Malchus, which that will set the stage and help us understand back to what Gan Eden is about, and then going back and forth to the whole discussion of Mutfa, Murgish, and Mushkel. Now, when you read it, and I'm completely speaking here from the human logic level, the Rebbe Rashab, of course, wrote it this way, so it's very precise. But sometimes I wonder, since it's volume 3, and the Rebbe Rashab did not break it into Maimorim, into chapters, whether he would have further developed this into chapters and you'd see much easier the flow. Because when you read it now, it seems like there's a lot of Eishis HaMachshava going on here, which means the Rebbe Rashab's thinking process that you have to try to calculate and figure out, like, what is he thinking when he's writing this? But I believe that when you read the whole thing and you go back, you begin to understand why he gave this whole introduction. So briefly, and here I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's very elaborate. I just want to bring it back. So he discusses the difference between the 2 levels of Reishis and Rishon. The difference between Keser and Chochma. Between Malchus and Mashpia. Just 1 second. Okay. So briefly, what it says in these 5 pages, he talks about the whole process of how from the highest levels, it arises in God's will to create. And that's ultimately leads to the lowest levels where the actual creation takes place. Called Keser and Malchus. And it's a long discussion. And frankly, the only way to really understand this connection is to go back to what we learned already. Well, we learned later, where if you remember, he spoke about the difference between Koydem Aleis HaRatzon and Aleis HaRatzon, how God, before the Tzimtzum, relates to existence, and how he's beyond existence. And that the Kelim, the Rishimu, reach the higher level, the Hela Ma'atzmi, and the Eir comes from the lower level that relates more to existence. So to really understand these 5 pages, you need to go back to that. But the reason I'm avoiding doing that right now is because I don't want to confuse matters. Since we're talking about Gan Eden and the questions around Gan Eden, I'd rather continue the flow about that, and then I'll go back to these 5 pages and say, okay, so how does this fit into the whole picture? But when we learned it, if you recall, I may have said that specifically, that these 5 pages really can only be understood after we read the entire discussion. Now, as I said, the Rebbe Rashab, in his brilliance, it was just flowing. So when he wrote this, he knew exactly what he wants to do. But for us to understand it, we need to go and read the whole picture. So let me go now. I'm going to jump to the bottom of page 1218, where he goes back to Gan Eden. So on the bottom, he says, after he finishes again, these 5 pages we will address. Right now, I'm just asking, let's leave it aside for a moment to keep the flow going here. So now he says, and he goes back to explain so he's repeating what we said before. The primary thing that neshamas benefit from godliness in Gan Eden is the result of our good deeds in this world. And this is what means Masha Omer Azal, schar mitzvah mitzvah. That the schar, the reward for a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. Like I said, it's not disconnected. When you give your child a toy because they behaved, the toy has nothing to do with what they do with their behavior. Mitzvah, on the other hand, generates an energy itself, and the reward, the energy generated of the mitzvah is from the mitzvah itself. So the mitzvah provides you with its very reward. And what is that reward? The schar va'inuk shebegan Eden is from the oros ha-mitzvah atzma. Okay, so Gan Eden, not the natural Gan Eden that was created, but we're talking about the abundance, the growth that came through our work. So Gan Eden essentially stores and is the place where you generate the energy, and Gan Eden is that level of that energy. And that's by Yunecheyu began Eden of the L'Shamra. God placed the person. This is where we were placed. The Adam was placed in the Garden of Eden to serve and protect. This is through the Avodah b'mitzvah sesa. It's oisin Gan Eden. That's how you build and you make Gan Eden, the garden, grow. Okay. Now the Rebbe Rashab continues for the next. Let's see here. The next page, 2 pages, is going to elaborate a bit about Gan Eden again. Now, when we learned this the first time, I remember pointing out that seemingly this seems to be just a continuation from page 1213. And in between the 5 pages I just mentioned seems to be somewhat, I don't want to say tangential, because in the flow of things, as I said, it would make sense. You continue with Gan Eden. But the Rebbe Rashab, for his own reason, did it this way. And as I said, I think it'll be understood once we get the whole picture. So now he goes on to explain more about this Avodah in Gan Eden. He says that in Medrash, it says, L'Avdul Shama goes on Karbonos. So now he's adding not just mitzvahs, but specifically offerings. I'm on page 1219. I'm just going to sum up 1219 and 1220. Then I will sum up the whole flow and bring us back to where we are now, on page 1271. So now he says Karbonos, okay? And that's why mitzvahs are compared to flames, neris, candles, ner mitzvah. Like we're now Hanukkah, so this is very fitting. Just as when you light flames, candles, it fills the whole house with light. So too, mitzvahs, like candles, fills the world, fills Gan Eden with light. Ziv b'Gan Eden. The parenthesis he adds that the souls are also called candles or flames. Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, the soul of a human being. The flame of God is Nishma Sodom, is the soul of a human being. Because neshamas also radiate and illuminate the lower world, and that's the whole purpose of the neshamas that come down below. So too, the neiros of the mitzvahs radiate Gan Eden. He doesn't go into detail, but obviously that the neshama with mitzvahs radiates this world. But here he's specifically emphasizing that the neshamas radiate, illuminate the world. And Gan Eden, and neiros mitzvahs me'irim es Gan Eden. They radiate Gan Eden. So Gan Eden is a garden. It has some light, because even naturally Gan Eden is already a Havaya Lakim. But when we do mitzvahs, we generate even more light, so we radiate and make it very bright. Gan Eden, very bright. Okay, so it's a little more elaboration simply on what we do through our Aveda. The Rebbe Rashab is being thorough, what our Aveda does to Gan Eden. Okay. Now he continues, he says, Umisha loy asa tev miyamov. Remember back on page 1212, we learned that Peishi Yisrael, people who do mitzvahs, but they don't have any intention. So they have the etzem, but they don't have the giluyim. So now he says, someone who never did good all their life, they are lacking this part of the pleasure and the oir and the energy and the light generated through Ma'asim Tevim. Vafilu choser hamitzvus yem echad hamitzvus choser yem echad choser hamshocha. In other words, Gan Eden is dependent on our work, our good deeds. So now, again, this seems to be the organization here. He's going back to topics he spoke about earlier. So now he asks the question. It's not understood. Isn't Gan Eden created before the creation of the world? So why do we say that Gan Eden is created through mitzvahs? So we already answered this question. Gan Eden exists on its own. It's a level, what we learned, the level of Bria Shebe Bria, or Keser Chochma Binah of Malchus. And then Aveda adds more. The Yichud Panim B'Panim. But if you may recall, that was in a parenthesis. Now the Rebbe Rashab is going back to elaborate more what is Gan Eden on its own and what is Gan Eden through Ma'aseh Mitzvahs, Ma'asim Tevim. So he says like this, this is one of the proofs I have that there's a lot of Eisius and Machshava here, because didn't he say that line back on top of page 1213? He said, and he spoke about it for a few lines or a quarter of a page, and then went on to a different topic. And now he's saying again, we have to understand the inyan of Gan Eden. So as I said, in a structured way, human logic like ours, not the brilliance of the Rebbe Rashab, it would seem that this should all go together. But nevertheless, I'm pointing it out in case you would notice it. He's going back, what is Gan Eden? And here he says, so there he said Gan Eden is Bria, Gan Eden Elyon, in it radiates Atzilus. Now he's going to add more. He says, Hine Gan Eden, hu mechinas Binah sheba Malchus. So if you remember on page 1211, he said it's Keser Chochma Binah of Malchus. Now he's saying it's Binah in Malchus. Like it says in the Eitz Chaim. And that's the difference in Gan Eden and the general worlds. In the regular worlds outside of Gan Eden, their Gilui is the 7 lower levels of Malchus. The 3 lowest is Netzach Ched Yesod. So it's Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach Ched Yesod, and Malchus Sheba Malchus, the lower. That's the worlds. Ubepratius, that's Malchus Sheba Malchus. That becomes the Keser of Bria. Ubegan Eden Elyon, Ubegan Eden Meir, Gimel Rishenus. Also, the 3 higher levels, Keser Chochma Binah, or in general, Binah. So really, he's repeating what he said, but he's giving us more descriptive elements. So we have now so far that Gan Eden is Keser Chochma Binah of Malchus. Now he says it's Binah of Malchus, or the Gimel Rishenus of Malchus. We also learned that it's Bria of Bria. He mentioned that. And we also learned that it's Atzilus as it radiates in Bria. And that's the Havaya Elokim. This is all not a contradiction because all of them indicate that it's a higher state. In Bria itself, it's a higher state. It's not just the 7 lower levels, it's the 3 higher levels. Okay. And now he said that is the level Gimel Rishenus. And so, and that's what creates the distinction that the Gili, the Klolos Elim is Subchinis Amitzias Levat. And the Gili of Gan Eden, the Bechinis Muhusa. So Mitzias means you know it exists, but you don't know anything about it. Muhus comes from the word mahu. What is it? Muhus means you understand what its quality. So, for example, a person can see a beautiful painting and not have a clue what the meaning is. They just see it's beautiful. Or someone can tell you a story about something that's very great. So you know it exists. Muhus means you get to know its personality. So really, Gan Eden means, when we said before, it's a higher state of spiritual consciousness. What does that mean? You know more about the artist than you would just knowing that the artist exists. As soon as you see art, you know there's an artist, but you don't know anything about him. In Gan Eden, you find out more about what this artist is like. So in the context of Mamala Kalam and Eres Bekelim, it makes total sense. When a child does a mitzvah, an act, or even an adult does a Maisa mitzvah, and there's no kavanah, you're not thinking about God, you're not thinking about the purpose of this mitzvah. What do you have? You have the mitzias. You have the etzem, yes. But as far as knowing about God, you don't know any much about him except that he told you to do this mitzvah. When you have kavanah, what does kavanah really mean? Not just that you have intention. It means you're thinking about godliness. You're thinking whether it's Kabbalah El Machal Shamayim, which generates energy in Gan Eden Atachten, or you think about the Seid Pnimi of the mitzvah, the details of it, what it accomplishes, how it elevates you, how it binds the mind, the heart, and the mind in tefillin. What are you doing? You're getting to know the personality of God. So that's why without kavanah, Gan Eden doesn't have a role to play. Gan Eden's role is revealing the mochus, something about godliness. Mitzias is the world itself, is the mitzias of godliness. What is that in spheres? That's the difference between the 7 lower spheres and the 3 higher spheres. So I'll give another example. A teacher is teaching 2 students. Okay? One of them is a beginner. The other one knows the teacher intimately well, meaning he's learned with him, he knows his methodology, he knows how he processes things. You know, a student that's like a Talmud Muvak, a student who's a student that is like a protege of the teacher. The other student knows the teachings. So when the teacher teaches the lower end student, that's like Zayin Tachtenis. He's revealing to him his 7 lower spheres, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes. But the Moichin of Keser Chochma Binah, only the other student is privy to that, because he knows what's going on in the mind of the teacher. The other student is receiving more of an outer reflection. So that would be the difference between the world's existence and Gan Eden. It's like a person who knows, like you see people on earth, there are people who exist and they know that they exist and they know something about existence, and there are people who know the secret of life. They know there's a deeper meaning, there's deeper purpose. In a way, that's the difference between Gan Eden and the worlds, according to what he's saying right here. In spheres, is the difference between the 7 lower levels of Malchus and the 3 higher, or generally Binah, because Binah is already a level of intellect. The 7 lower ones are more the teacher's expression through the seichel coming through the midas, which means more his expression and relating to the student, in contrast to the teacher's mind on its own. So that's the difference between Gan Eden and the world. That's what he said here now. Zayin Tachtenis and now he goes back. What's the difference between Gan Eden and Elyon and Gan Eden and Tachten? says, "V'hine Gan Eden ha'elyon hu bo'elam habriya." V'hine Gan Eden ha'elyon bo'elam habriya. Meir sham b'chinas gimel rashein is the malchus. That's Atzilus. And the primary gili is in Binah sheba malchus. So clearly he's seeing here, that's Gan Eden ha'elyon. U'b'toichem melubish b'chinas Keser and Chochma Shining. So the primary gili is Binah, but within it you also have Keser and Chochma. As we learned earlier, he cites the Maimer, that Binah, since it's part of Seichel, understanding, Binah also has the Nekuda, the resonating truth of Chochma, and it has that superconscious awareness of Keser. So though Binah is lower than Keser and Chochma, but it's packaged together. So Binah encompasses all three. Like he said, Kodesh HaKadoshim. Binah nikra shviyah, shekel kol g'meshenes. The Gan Eden ha'elyon shebe'elam ha'briya, hu b'chinas Keser Chochma Binah de Briya, heichol Kodesh HaKadoshim. Kodesh HaKadoshim are three levels of Kodesh, and Kadoshim 2, so it's 3. This is the level of Shvi'ah, which is Binah. When you count from the bottom up, Binah is not the 8th sphere because you don't count Malchus, it's the 7th. It's like Shabbos. So, and that's what it means that God planted Hashem Elikim, the Hashem Binu hu Havaya b'nikud Elikim. Okay, that's a Kabbalistic concept that Havaya Elikim, Binah is Havaya, it radiates Havaya, but has Havaya is the pronunciation of Elikim, but it's really Havaya within Elikim. That's Gan Eden. Now that's Gan Eden on its own. Hamshach b'chinas Binah shemeir sham tamid she'ein zeh hamshach sh'adei aveda. This is the level of Bria of Gan Eden on its own. That which was created before the human being was put into Gan Eden. Like he says in Likutei Torah, that's Gili of Gan Eden on its own. The next paragraph on page 1219, he goes down and says, one second. Yeah. On the next page, he's going to go back to Gan Eden through Avodah. So what he's added now, as I said, in a logical sequence, it would seem that this should be put earlier. But this is the way the Rebbe Rashab ordered it, so we're going with this order. Now, the next paragraph, he continues to explain further what Gan Eden is about. I explained it already, but I'll just go over some of the lines he uses. That Gan Eden is an appreciation of the mohus of the artist, in the example I'm giving. So you could read a book or you could see art and know there's an author, but you don't know anything about the author, definitely not his personality. So Gan Eden is you're getting to know God, basically. So he says now, what is the primary function? What is the primary activity in Gan Eden? Is souls taking pleasure in godliness. As they get to know God, they take pleasure. You know, we have many pleasures in life, and most of us are drawn to physical pleasures, material pleasures. The true pleasure is in the higher reality of godliness. So that's what Gan Eden Misangem el Elokus. And this means b'chinas Keser sheba malchus. Now we come to start understanding why he brought the whole Ani Rishon v'Ani Achrin, because he wanted to say that in Malchus, what is Keser in Malchus? The highest levels of the divine are revealed in Malchus in Gan Eden. Which what we learned earlier, this is the Ratzon v'Atainu b'Melucha. Remember we learned, we learned that you can know that there's a house, and you build a house, but you don't know what is the Pnimius HaKavana within this house. What is the inner intention of the creator of this structure? So here we're begin to get a sense of the godliness within this structure. It's still not the etzem, but at least it's some understanding of the artist as he relates to existence. Just to put it into context, the artist also has an etzem that's not even higher, that's higher than art and higher than being an artist. But the fact of the matter is, we as human beings, if we cannot relate to the artist as an artist, it's going to be far harder to relate to the artist that is beyond being an artist. That's why we need, again, the Giluyim of Seder Shtalshalis acclimates us to be godly people. Not just that the Etzem and Hashem is connected to the Etzem of Elokus. In essence, when he says in Tanya in chapter 4, which I'm teaching now, that through the levushim that a person manifests, thought, speech, and action in Torah and Mitzvahs is higher than the neshama, because the neshama is deeper and higher in its root. It's rooted in chelik elokam emal mamish. But it doesn't mean you are a godly person. It means you have within you the etzem neshama. But we need you to be a godly person. You need someone that their arms and their legs and their, as I said before, eyes and their very being is godliness. That their life is driven by godliness. And that requires avodah. That's not just etzem neshama. And that avodah is the avodah of getting to know God through the kavanah of mitzvahs, or like he's saying here, the tainug the pleasure we get in Gan Eden from the work we do in this world. And that is called in spheres Keser Shebemalchus. So the rest of the world that doesn't have that only has the godliness that is manifest in creation, that's necessary for creation. But Gan Eden is privy to the deeper inner workings, which is called Keser Shebemalchus, like the teacher, like the student, the higher level student that understands the mind of his teacher more than just a beginner or an outsider. However, it's not pure Keser, meaning purely God's will. It's as it manifests in Binah, through our understanding and through our learning and through our processing, we come to relate to it. That's why in Gan Eden, it's not just pleasure as in pleasure, it's a pleasure that comes through understanding God. But don't we know that the main primary pleasure is when you get the innovation of a concept? He says, but in Chachma, it's more beyond understanding. It's just a sense. It's like that flash. So Gan Eden is Binah. That's why Binah is the primary force. It has within it Chochma and Keser, the truth, the resonating truth, and the higher reality of Keser, but it's through the lens of understanding. Okay. I know I've been going on for a while here. I maybe should, even though I want to finish up the summary, but let me stop for a moment if anybody wants me to clarify anything that I said so far in this class. As you see, when you hear it now, it takes on a whole different meaning than when we learned it, because we learned everything that came afterwards. And when we start connecting it, the dots, it really becomes a really very powerful, very large, I should say, broad perspective. Does anybody want any clarification of so far what I've said? Okay. Good. So now, in the parentheses, I want to read the parentheses just briefly. He says, just like we learned that there's two levels in Malchus. So what did we learn? There's Hisnasis Atzmai, how the king is on his own, removed from existence. And then there's Ratzon Hagali, where he has a revealed desire for existence. So he says that the worlds originate from the Ratzon Hagali, the Mashu B'chinas Makal Elim, Malchus Sheba Malchus. Like we said, the 7 lower levels of Malchus. And the Sheirisham Shacher from Keser Malchus Anirishin, and the Amshach of Gan Eden, Shorsham B'chinas Hatainug Sheba B'chinas Keser Malchus. Not just that God wants and wants to relate to us, but the deeper inner pleasure of God in the creation. And that's why it's Binah Sheba Malchus. So basically, the world is more like the student that just appreciates existence and the creator of existence. And Gan Eden, you also understand the creator somewhat. And you're also therefore accessing the pleasure that he has within existence, the pleasure that he has within building this home. That's what he adds in the parentheses, which connects it far more to this whole long discussion on Niresh and Achrin. And now we understand somewhat why these 5 pages come here, because for the Rebbe Rashab, he was laying the ground for understanding the whole difference between Gan Eden and the worlds. Okay. But the truth is, it's even more understood after we learn these entire 50 pages and come back to where we are on page 1271. Okay. Now, in Chassidus, everything is always gradations. In other words, when something is rooted in the Gimel Rishonis, then you go further and you say Sheiresh Sharshei. What is the root of this Hamshacha in Gan Eden? Is Keser Datzilus. Right now we said it was Keser of Malchus. The higher level, the Tainug of Keser of Malchus. Even higher, it's Keser of Atzilus. And here again he brings Ani Rishon Ani Achin, Keser of Malchus. And that then is Nimshach in the Tchilas Hamshach, the beginning is in Chochma. And in Binah, he gets shaped. Here is the expression of Mitzvah Yeseh B'Binah, because Binah shapes the experience. Remember, if you have a glimpse, let's go back to the analogy with the artist. You know somewhat, the first level of the world only know that there's an existence of an artist. That's it. You see a creation, you know there's a creator. You see a book, you know there's an author. You see a painting, you know there's an artist. In Gan Eden, we're getting to understand, due to our Avodah, we're coming to understand something more about this artist. Keser is like the essential pleasure of this artist in creating the art. Chochma is a glimpse. It's only a flash. Binah is we're getting a full-blown details about what this artist is like. That's why Binah is so prominent here. And then from Chochma Binah, it's nimshach into Zah, all the way to Malchus. The same thing. I'm now on page 1220. It's only a little more until the end of this page will be the summary, and then begins the whole discussion of the levels of the maturation of emotions and growth. And v'chochma binas nimshal lazal mizol malchus. Okay. Now the next section is going back to the concept of planting the garden in Eden. And this will be very relevant later, if you remember, on page, let me just point it out. We brought the medrash, the three different Yizbu Atze Havaya, that the trees in Gan Eden are sated. I believe, I'm just looking where the page was. Yeah. On page 1260. What we learn on page 1260 is connected somewhat to this page 1220. So he says now like this. And this is what it says in Medrash Rabbah, that from the beginning of creation, God was involved only in planting things. That's why it says he planted a garden in Eden. What's the point he wants to make here? He wants to show how Gan Eden is central to the entire process of Avodas Ha'adam. Because when you look in Chumash, even literal interpretation of the verses, what do you see? Okay, 6 days God created all the creation, all the daimim tzemeya chai. Comes the sixth day, before he creates a human being, he creates a garden in Eden. It clearly plays a very prominent role because that's where he's going to put his crown jewel, Adam. So even without any commentary, just reading the verses, it's very clear that Gan Eden reflects the place where the human being will do their work. Like we said, that he places human being in the garden to work it, la'avda l'shamra, to work and protect, to serve and protect this garden. Now, what does that mean in context of? It's not just that Adam HaRishon was a gardener; that this reflects the essence of who we are. God created a world. The world on its own is the art that God created. He then created a garden where you can have access to the deeper workings and the inner workings and the pleasures of God, the artist, in this art. And he places a human being there to serve. Love the L'Shamra, when you serve through your mitzvahs, positive and negative, what you're doing is creating a deeper awareness and cognizance of the artist's inner workings, the muhus of the artist, and also his pleasure. So Gan Eden is not just some distant planet where neshamas go to after they pass. It actually captures the very essence of Avodah. That Avodah elevates the world and reveals higher levels of divine that the world itself would not know of. Gan Eden is the place. Now, the concept of Gan Eden with neshamas, yes, neshamas come to this world, they work and do their Avodah. The produce and the fruits of their labor is so-called stored in this Gan Eden. When the neshamas leave this world, they will go to this place, and that's where they will enjoy the understanding, hasaga, and the tainug of God, the artist. Now, do we have a glimpse of it in this world as well? That we shall discuss. Some people have. Elam chatir b'chayecha, hitimon me'en elam haba. Later, going to learn about it. But right now, that is the picture. So the Rebbe Rashab in this page is going to show how this is so fundamental. The Medrash says that God was not busy with anything but planting. What does that mean? Well, God has nothing to do but to plant gardens, So the answer is because Oda Meitzah Soda. I mean, I'm asking the question. He doesn't ask it that way. Because this reflects planting is not just planting a garden. It reflects Oda Meitzah Soda. The human being is the tree of the field. That the Bechinas Adam Shalakise, the Adam Elyon that sits on the supernal throne, is called a tree in the field. And that level is Zah of Atzilus. So Zah of Atzilus is essentially the tree of the field in Gan Eden. And he brings the two interpretations on Im Yeshba Eitz Im Ayin, Moshe Rabbeinu's words to the Meraglim, that Yeshba Eitz means, is there a tree, is the tree rooted in the level of Zah, or is it rooted in the level of Malchus, in Ayin, the Keser? And that's what it means, and those are the plantings of the garden. We're talking about the fundamental creation of levels that will allow for a garden and allow for a garden to grow and bear fruit. What we're talking about is the fruit is the divine pleasures and divine understanding and pleasure that the neshamas have. And the root of this pleasure, the root of this hamshacha in the garden is from Eden, Gan be'Eden. He planted the garden in Eden. Eden is Chochma, and that's the meaning of Anar Yotza Eden. A river flowed from Eden. Binah shenimshach b'chinas Chochma. Eden is Chochma, like we said. Binah receives from Chochma the flash. Chochma receives from Ayin, Keser, and Binah is the river. No, Yotza Eden b'chinas Binah flows from Chochma. Then he continues to explain, more breaks it down further, that Eden Ilah is the level of Keser, which means that the Chochma is rooted in Keser, and there goes into Chochma. And from the pleasure of Chochma Stemah, the superconscious pleasure, in the pleasure in the superconscious state from Keser, goes into Malchus and into Gan Eden Elyon of Bria. Okay, and I feel I'm going to stop here. I wanted to finish the whole summary, but I didn't end up finishing it. I'm going to stop here. So look at the beginnings, the first third of page 1220. I want to conclude this summary maybe tomorrow. We'll do it tomorrow. And then comes the whole 50-page discussion and bring it back to where we're up to now. So I hope this is helpful because it's putting things again into context. But I'll stop here if anybody, I'm going to stop right here. Right? Anybody has any questions? And I hope you see the benefit in this, why we're doing this. Not just going back, it's put things into far better perspective. Okay. Any comments, questions? I think we broke a record. Nobody's asked anything today.
It's review. We're supposed to know it already, right?
Okay. Okay, so we'll stop here.